Just to go over what we had already, or where we had stopped, we were talking about jury decisions and how co-witnesses can have an impact on their final decision. While there are no solutions currently applicable to field use, research has discovered potential co-witness techniques that have proven themselves in controlled environments. The initial interview, or an interview taken at the scene of an event, is referenced in multiple sources, with one study by Miura and Maxwell advocating that that technique has a positive effect on the amount of accurate information retrieved. In addition to the initial interview, the warning method is thoroughly referenced. Practicing the warning method means simply telling potential witnesses to retain accurate information for interviews. While one study argues that this warning method is not effective, the general consensus in the field is that it has a positive impact. A study by Recton et al. Concluded that the warning method allows people to be more aware for the potential of misinformation to be present. Now that we have taken a look at previous research, let's examine my experiment and the gap it filled in the field. Any quality study begins with a research question, with my study hoping to determine the effect of an authoritative, inaccurate co-witness on juveniles. Before I conducted my experiment, I constructed both a research and null hypothesis. My research hypothesis stated that if adolescents are introduced to misinformation through authoritative co-witnesses, then the adolescents will be more prone to accept that misinformation as true. My null hypothesis stated that the introduction of misinformation through authoritative figures will have no impact on how that information is received. Prior to running tests, I defined key variables in my experiment. My independent variable was the presence of an authoritative co-witness during a recall survey. The Chatham High School librarian, Mrs. Deborah Maxey, was kind enough to participate and serve as the authoritative co-witness. My dependent variable was the testimonial accuracy of the participants, and my control group consisted of the surveys taken by participants with no presence of the co-witness. Finally, there were many constants, but the most notable included the length of the two videos, the difficulty of each survey, and the length of time allotted for the filler activity. To begin the process of my research, I obtained consent from all parties, including Dr. Mark Jones, Mrs. Deborah Maxey, and all of the participants and their guardians. I then gathered the materials pertinent to my research, including self-made surveys consisting of 5 free recall questions, video footage taken from Disney's Mary Poppins, a stopwatch, and crossword puzzles. To ensure the legitimacy of my data, I randomized my sample of 16 11th and 12th grade students attending Chatham High School. Both the control and experimental groups were then shown one of 2 videos and were asked to complete a crossword filler activity for 5 minutes. The 6th step applied only to the experimental group, as this was when the participants were given the inaccurate co-witness survey with confidence ratings. Next, the participants were asked to complete the pre-recall survey and to rate their confidence in each answer on a scale of 1 to 7. Each question in the survey asked the participants to identify simple details from the video, including colors, shapes, and the amounts of certain items. After all surveys were completed, I graded and recorded the scores of each. I concluded my study by conducting statistical analysis. When conducting my statistical analysis, I ran a paired samples t-test to determine the significance of my data. I then took the results of my statistical analysis and drew conclusions regarding the validity of my experiment. At the significance level of 0.05, neither null hypothesis was rejected, with the test score data having a p-value of 0.82 and the confidence rating data having a p-value of 0.53. For the purpose of simple viewing, I decided to display my data in a bar graph. While the data from this current study was not statistically significant, this method of display clearly shows that there was a slight decline in the averages of both the test scores and the confidence ratings after the introduction of the authoritative co-witness. This slight decline in the test scores shows that there could have been an impact due to the co-witness on test scores. And the slight decline in the confidence ratings meant that there could have been an effect on the participants from the co-witness. There's not sufficient evidence at the 0.05 significance level to conclude that authoritative co-witnesses have an impact on juvenile witnesses. However, the data that was collected from this sample leads me to believe that further research should be conducted to draw more accurate conclusions. If new research showed more significant results, this would call for immense reform in our approach to handling juvenile witnesses in the future. Previously reviewed literature by researchers such as Recton et al., Hope and Gabbert, and Miller supported that co-witnesses have a profound impact on testimony. And a study by Zafar et al. Showed that the impact of authority on confidence. Considering this information, it is reasonable to assume that this small-scale experiment is the first of many inquiries that I will make into the concept of juvenile co-witness manipulation. While I conducted the experiment to the best of my ability, there were some limitations that could have hindered my success. First, my sample size was much smaller than the typical co-witness experiment. In my research, I found that many similar studies used upwards of 100 participants when conducting their experiment. Additionally, the lack of previously used embedded testing materials could have hindered my success. When I was creating these surveys, there could have been bias present in the questions that I was unaware of as I was writing them. It would also be unwise of me to list limitations without mentioning the time constraint on my current study. Typically, the studies that I found in my research were given the time to test participants individually, while I had to test participants in groups of 2, 3, or even 4. While the study did not produce significant results, there are some lessons to be learned for people attempting future research. First and foremost, there should obviously be more participants to ensure the sample is an accurate representation of the population. Previously vetted testing materials should be used also to ensure that the surveys are assessing people on accurate details in the videos. It might even be beneficial to use CCTV footage of actual crimes occurring opposed to whimsical music videos taken from a Disney movie. Additionally, future research should include videos that are more applicable to the justice system. Some people might wonder why I would conduct a study on such a complex topic, knowing that I would be unable to produce significant results. Truth be told, I chose the study because I knew that it would give me insight into something that I thought I was passionate about. Just as I suspected, this process confirmed my passion for law, and I've never been more excited to study a field of knowledge. I also learned a great deal about looking past the surface of human interactions to get a deeper meaning of what it means to be human. This is a skill that I think will serve me well as I move into my career as a lawyer, and one that I think we should all possess. I would like to thank all who helped to facilitate this opportunity for me. Thank you to Dr. Bocock and Dr. Jones for approving this process and this research idea and allowing me to conduct my research. Thank you to Ms. Long for helping me through this long and tiring process. It definitely wasn't easy, but we made it. So she was a great help. I also want to thank Ms. Maxey for allowing me to use the library for my experiment and participating as the authoritative co-witness. And finally, I would like to thank all of my participants who were willing to participate in my study without any promise of a reward. At this time, I open the floor to any questions.
Cody, I think you mentioned this, but so how will this help you prepare to become a lawyer in working with younger groups of people?
Dr. Jones is asking how my study could help me as I move into my career as a lawyer. And I think this is something that will really help me or benefit me as I begin to practice, not necessarily in law school, but once I get out into the real world, because something that lawyers have to deal with a lot is witnesses who are conversing and talking to each other. And being that I now have an inept knowledge and a deep knowledge of this topic, it's something that I can help to avoid running into as I move into my career as a lawyer. I know that lawyers have groups of people that they have to speak with and talk to all the time, so it could help me to be more aware of possibly misinformation spreading between my witnesses as I'm working as a lawyer in the courtroom or in my practice. And I think that this is just something that'll be really beneficial overall.
I have a follow-up as well. So would it be important for law enforcement to ask witnesses to write down what they saw? Is that helpful?
Dr. Jones is asking if it is helpful for witnesses to write down what they saw. And as I was going into my research, I actually read an article, one of the articles, I didn't choose it for my literature review, but it discussed how writing can actually allow you to get more accurate and more detailed reports as opposed to just talking about things with people. And I think that the combination of writing possibly with the initial interview that we talked about earlier in my literature review, or writing stuff down as soon as it happens at the scene of an event, I think that would be really beneficial to avoid this co-witness phenomenon from happening.
Cody, can you give us some examples of some of the questions that you asked?
Mrs. Collins is asking for some examples of questions that were asked, I'm guessing on the survey. For example, one of the questions, it was Mary Poppins. I used supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. I know, it's a mouthful. But that was one of the music videos I used, and one of the questions I asked was how many members were in the animated band that was bouncing across the screen, or what was the color of Mary Poppins' horse that she rode in at the beginning of the scene. It was just simple questions like that that wouldn't normally catch your eye as you're watching a video, but it's something that you kind of store in the back of your mind as you're watching movies and such. So those were the questions that I came up with.
Did you see any correlation between things that you thought that the students would be interested in their memory?
Ms. Collins is asking if I saw any correlation between correct answers and things that students might be interested in or might be flashy and catch your eye. When I was making the survey, I watched the videos multiple times before I wrote any questions, and I tried to pick details that were seemingly similar in the video that weren't necessarily flashy, but just enough to where you wouldn't miss it if you were actually looking for it. For example, one of my other ones was how many feathers were in the hats of the band members. So it's just little stuff like that. I didn't really notice any difference in the details that were used. When I did conduct my statistical analysis, I did use the 3 most commonly correct questions out of the 5 to score my sheets. And I think that that kind of helped to eliminate that idea of some questions were more popularly answered correct than others. Yes, Ms. Kim?
I noticed, okay, so in your informed consent, were the participants aware of the role of the co-witness? Like, were they aware that that was their job that they were fulfilling, or were they kind of, it's not necessarily, you didn't tell them, or they weren't, it was unclear of what their role was, but was that in your informed consent that they were, what their role was?
Ms. Kent is asking if the participants were aware of the role of the authoritative co-witness. Ms. Maxey, as she was in the library while they were taking their surveys. They were actually told on their informed consent form that my topic was juvenile co-witness manipulation, but they were not told explicitly that Ms. Maxey would be the one in there with them. So they were given an idea of the topic, but weren't necessarily sure who was fulfilling that role of the co-witness. And it was totally up to the participants if they were, researching and studying what co-witnesses were before they came in to do the experiment. And I think that that is another limitation, possibly, of my experiment.
Did you debrief your participants afterwards to whether or not they, did you tell them that was their role in their debriefing?
I did do it. Ms. Ken is asking if I debriefed afterwards, and I did do a brief debrief after each of the participants were done with their second trial, because I used participants twice, one with the co-witness, one without the co-witness. So I had to wait until everyone had taken both tests. So after their second survey was completed, that's when they were debriefed on the topic.
Thank you.
Mr. Eads.
You mentioned some time constraints when you were questioning people. Can you describe the environment where you questioned people, and could that have influenced the results of your study?
Mr. Eads is asking me to describe the environment of where I was testing the individuals and whether or not that could have had an impact on the questions and their ability to answer the questions with the videos. All the participants were questioned in the same environment. They were in the library, in the section to the left as you go in where the computers are. They were all stationed, separated by computers, and they were watching the videos on the computers with identical sets of headphones within the library, and I asked that everyone in the library remain quiet and away from that area. And I think that this was a good environment for them to do this because they were really able to focus and pay attention to what they were doing. And I know it's not necessarily what they'd be doing out in the real world as a witness, but it was something that I felt was important to this study as I was just conducting it in the library with students. So I didn't want them to be distracted in any way. They weren't allowed to talk to each other during the experiment, so I tried to keep it as controlled as possible.
Were they all present when you questioned them, or were they separated during questions?
Mr. Eads is asking if they were all present when they were questioned or if they were separated. Each of the participants were given a survey on paper, and they were given the survey, still not allowed to talk to each other after they had completed the crossword filler for 5 minutes. I set a timer. Once the timer was complete, I passed out the survey to everyone, and then they were given an unlimited amount of time to complete the survey to get the best results possible. And Ms. Boulevard.
Sorry. What methods did you use to choose your participants?
Mrs. Beauregard is asking what methods I used to choose my participants. We actually passed out consent forms to multiple classes. I tried to get classes with a variety of students from different academic backgrounds and different age groups. I didn't want to choose all seniors, and I didn't want to choose all AP or advanced students. So I went in multiple classrooms and passed out consent forms, and then as I was receiving them, I numbered the participants in the order that I received the consent forms. And then I numbered each participant and randomly assigned to them whether or not that they were in the experimental group first for their first survey or the control group. And then they were opposite for their second survey.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am, thank you.